People can feel safe crossing this bridge because it was designed to support lots of traffic going back and forth every day. But what if it hadn't been designed with human beings and their vehicles in mind? What if the Brooklyn Bridge had been constructed as a big perch for pigeons?
Well, that'd be remarkably altruistic.
Perhaps to keep them off the buildings of Manhattan.
Oh, okay. Remarkably poorly thought out, then.
In that case, wouldn't it be utterly foolish to drive your car across it?
Why? I mean, regardless of whether you realize your ridiculously over-designed pigeon perch can hold a car when you build it, it still can. The object you proposed is just the Brooklyn Bridge, except built for a silly reason. And you can still drive a car over the Brooklyn Bridge just fine, no matter how silly your reason for building it was. You know, it's sort of like how if you design a hammer and you say it's meant to be used as a dinner plate, it'll still work to drive nails into wood.
Does it make sense to trust something with a task that goes vastly beyond what it was meant to do?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're not sure that the bridge is going to hold the weight of a vehicle, you might want to give it a test or two before you go driving across it. And if it doesn't pass testing, which it will because it's the Brooklyn Bridge, but even if it didn't, maybe find some way to reinforce it until it reliably holds the weight all the way across. And then, yeah, obviously it makes sense. You seem a little bit confused about what makes something work for a purpose. What makes something work for a purpose is not whether it was built for that purpose, but whether it has attributes that allow it to be used or adapted to suit that purpose.
This is the basic idea behind the argument from reason.
Oh, well, the argument from reason sounds kind of stupid then, don't you think?
This is the basic idea behind the argument from reason, which is mainly an argument against naturalism. Naturalism is the claim that the natural world is all that exists. No God, no angels, no demons, just matter, energy, and natural forces. Many atheists are naturalists. But the argument from reason can also be used to support belief in God. So, here goes.
Ask me the questions, Bridgekeeper. I am not afraid.
Human beings have the ability to reason. We're using it right now. We wouldn't have discussions like this if we thought that our cognitive faculties, the processes that produce our beliefs, were unreliable.
As a half-reptoid, half-demon, half-human hybrid, I feel qualified to speak about this. So, clearly, our belief-producing abilities are unreliable. Sure, we're sitting here having a discussion. We can agree on basic syntax and the meanings of words, usually, but we believe totally different things. You believe God exists. You believe he sent Jesus to die for our sins and all that, whereas I believe it's all a myth that's taken way too seriously. You believe that if the Brooklyn Bridge was built to hold pigeons, it would be insane to think it might be able to hold a car, whereas I believe that the strength of a structure is based on what the structure is and not why it was built. And these differences of opinion exist for pretty much any truth claim you can think of, including the one I'm making right now. Different humans believe all kinds of mutually exclusive things. One single human can even hold multiple contradictory beliefs in their own head. So clearly, the mechanisms humans use to form beliefs are not completely reliable. And yet we're still having this conversation, so of course we're able to have these conversations even though the abilities that produce our beliefs are unreliable. Why would we not be able to? Now, you could act like a little kid and say, "Aha! I got you! You admitted your reasoning is flawed." Yeah, I did. That's because I'm not full of shit. And I'm not so cocky that I think I lack the weaknesses that every single human being on this planet has. But if someone decides to be that cocky, well, it doesn't make them any less flawed or any less wrong.
But naturalists have a problem here because they can only explain things by appealing to natural objects, natural events, natural causes.
Oh, I didn't realize there was anything to explain. What did you want explained exactly?
Think about this for a moment. You have beliefs. Ultimately, according to naturalism, your beliefs must be the result of physical processes in your brain. Now, what's going on in here? Particles in motion, chemical reactions, neurons firing, it's all physical, governed by laws of nature, not by commitment to truth.
Right, kind of like how your computer is governed by laws of nature, not by YouTube videos and Photoshop. And?
So what really seems like careful reasoning to you is actually straightforward, mechanical, mindless cause and effect, a fancy array of falling dominoes.
That's right. That in and of itself is not a problem. A computer can reach a correct result even though it's just a mechanical, mindless system of cause and effect. As a matter of fact, I would argue that a system that does not operate based on cause and effect is a hell of a lot less likely to produce a correct result. Because otherwise, what you have in your head is basically the infinite improbability drive from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The problem with humans is in the fact that humans have complex processes that prevent cold hard reasoning to varying degrees. Emotional commitments to ideas or people even when they're false or harmful. Too much willingness to jump to conclusions. Pattern seeking and agency seeking so strong that they generate tons of false positives. And on and on and on and on and on.
Illusions aside, then, you arrive at your beliefs via a process that has absolutely nothing to do with whether those beliefs are true or false. Chemicals couldn't conceivably care less.
Right, exactly. Which is exactly why you have 1 billion or so Hindus, 1.5 billion or so Muslims, a couple of billion Christians, not to mention the countless other religions, and all of those groups have significant differences of beliefs within them as well. It's why some people believe in ghosts, and others in aliens, and others in transdimensional Sasquatches. It's why people believe you can heal someone by hovering your hands over parts of their body, and others think you can do it with magic water, and others believe you can get rich by creating a vision board. Billions of people believe mutually exclusive things. Every single person has some belief that conflicts with some other person's belief, and they can't all be right. Based simply on the axiom that two contradictory things can't be true, the vast majority of these crazy beliefs are wrong. No, Dave. Naturalists are not the ones with the problem here. If you disagree with my assessment of human reason, then you're the one with the problem, because your assessment does not match reality.
So, if naturalism is true, what sense does it make to trust our reasoning ability or our beliefs or even our belief in naturalism?
Whether naturalism is true or not, it makes no sense to trust our reasoning in the simplistic way that you're talking about. Regardless of whether God invented souls that drive our reasoning or if we're just meat computers, the facts are still plain. Humans believe an unbelievable amount of stupid shit for stupid reasons. It's not the exception, Dave, it's the rule. Again, it comes back to your confusion about the Brooklyn Bridge. The reason why our reasoning is so terrible is completely irrelevant to the fact that it is terrible, as all of the evidence shows us. And so yeah, you should not place your full trust in the truth of naturalism. You also shouldn't place your full trust in the existence of God. This is why we have skepticism. If you recognize that you can be deceived, then if you actually want to be right, you're going to need to find a way to avoid being deceived. And that way is to refuse to strongly believe any important claim until you have solid evidence to support it. It's not always going to work because you're still human, but it will prevent you from assuming something's true when you have no good reason to. And speaking of assumptions, I'd propose that in the light of our horrible ability to reason, we might just be safer in making the fewest possible assumptions. Because the more assumptions we make, the more likely we big dummies are to get something wrong. So for example, if you observe humans thinking and doing things, and you see that stuff is reliably happening within their brains when they do it, and you can modify the things they think and do, and you add chemicals or electrical currents into the brain or the nervous system, and your prediction was that if naturalism is true, then humans should have poor reasoning ability when it comes to the bigger questions, and indeed there doesn't appear to be much consistency in reasoning whatsoever between different people regarding those questions, so clearly there is a hell of a lot of poor reasoning going on, then it's safer to believe that the mind is a product of the physical brain than to assume, in addition to all of that, the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent creator God that sent a son to die on a cross to save people from sin. But hey, do what you like, man. It's not like I expect you to act rationally. I'm a naturalist.
But it gets worse. How did we acquire our reasoning ability, according to the naturalist? Human beings obtained the ability to reason through the creative powers of evolution, natural selection acting on random mutation. Obviously, the random mutation part isn't going to fill us with a tremendous degree of confidence, so the question is whether we can count on our good friend, natural selection, to sift through all the intellectually deficient mutant traits, leaving us with a reliable belief-forming mutant trait.
Okay, I've already answered this, and the answer was clearly it didn't. So instead, I can just pick at your terminology. It's weird that you characterize reason as one single trait. I mean, I can see how you got there, but wouldn't it make more sense to characterize it as a collection of traits? Also, the fact that you would characterize a trait or a property of an organism as intellectually deficient in and of itself is a bit odd, since traits and properties don't have minds. Also, when you say natural selection is sifting through traits, it sounds like you're assigning it intention, when the whole point is it doesn't have intention. Whatever, nitpicking over, you can continue.
Here you might want to pull out your Biology 101 textbooks. Does natural selection favor philosophical insight?
Nope. Or at least not for most of our biological history. Which is why most people are so damn terrible at philosophy. And why most philosophy literature is just philosophers fighting with each other about philosophy.
Mathematical skill?
To a limited extent. At least the ability to see where there's more or less of something, which is all you really need to get started. After that, it's just a matter of combining that with the idea of symbolic representation to come up with easier ways to solve problems as needed. Yeah, but it's damn hard to teach most humans complex math, so we're not really all that good at that either. And if it's just about the ability to actually do the math after the principles have already been figured out, we're incredibly slow and we can't even do the somewhat more difficult stuff in our heads. Computers are literally trillions of times faster than we are, and they don't even need paper or pencils.
Scientific acumen?
Oh wow, no, of course not. People in general are astonishingly terrible at science. They're even terrible just at understanding the basic method of science and the reason it's necessary. That's why people like Deepak Chopra are so popular and why people give their money to that Padre scam site. It's why Kent Hovind still has supporters. It's why at the last Olympics there were all those athletes into cupping. It's why there are so many Muslims who believe their bathrooms are haunted by jinn. And it's why you need to work so hard if you want to enter a scientific career. That's why it took our civilization so long to get to where it is scientifically. Because this stuff is not easy for people. But that's not the point of the scientific method. It wasn't designed to be intuitive. It wasn't designed to be something that would easily fit into people's existing reasoning. It's not made to pander to unaided human reasoning. It's a tool to patch the holes in that reasoning. And the method is verified to work by its practical results and its ability to generate and verify predictions. It was designed from the ground up based on what produced results, and what produces results is taking as much of the human element out of the process as you possibly can. An experiment should be designed so that as little human interference as possible is needed, and it should be set up to answer a single prediction with an expected result, and if that result is different from the one that the human reasoned it should be, either something went wrong and the experiment should be repeated, or the prediction was wrong. The human reasoning was wrong. And the methodology should be reviewed by others to make sure a second set of experienced eyes can't find any flaws or faulty assumptions. But of course that doesn't always work either. There's plenty of stuff published in peer-reviewed journals that should not have passed peer review. And preferably, other people should do the experiment as well to make sure it wasn't a fluke or a fake. Observations should be subject to similar restrictions. And the reason for all of this is that scientists are perfectly aware that all people, themselves included, are fallible. If you're paying even the slightest bit of attention, it should be clear to you that history is full of incorrect guesses based on faulty human reasoning, and that's exactly why the scientific method was constructed. And the only reason that method continues to be used, and why even the Kent Hovinds and Zakir Naiks of the world wish their ideas were seen as scientific, is that the method has gained so much respect by proving itself, by producing results that can be put to practical use, such as building the Brooklyn Bridge pigeon perch, or probing the inner workings of a living brain, and making specific predictions which are then fulfilled. But even still, a disturbingly low number of people in the world have a good understanding of this method, and a good number don't even understand it after it's been explained to them multiple times. So Dave, do humans naturally have scientific acumen?
Of course not.
Right.
Natural selection favors traits that help organisms survive and reproduce. So if human reason evolved, it's either because it helped us survive and reproduce, or it's a complete biological accident.
The fact that it helped us survive and reproduce in the wild is part of why it's causing so many problems now. When the most rational thing is to feel like any hint of sound or movement is a creature because it might save your life or let you eat today, when there's a strong survival benefit in feeling emotionally connected to other people, and when a strong ability to find patterns in things like broken branches and falling leaves could help you find prey or understand that winter is coming, then you've basically got the recipe for all the terrible reasoning you see in pretty much everyone around you today.
Would this give us any basis for trusting our reasoning ability when we're dealing with questions of theology or philosophy or cosmology?
Do you trust other people's reasoning ability in those areas? Do you trust mine? Look, I'll trust my own reasoning to some extent because it's the only reasoning I've got. There's nothing else I can do. I'm stuck in my head. Now, I do what I can. I try to make sure that my reasoning is based on the most limited set of assumptions possible and as free as possible from contradiction as I can get it, and I try to make sure that I'm always open to revising my opinions, and it seems to be working out okay so far. But I sure as hell do not trust it with absolute certainty. If I did, I would be a complete idiot. I've been wrong before, just like everyone else, just like you. I'm not going to declare that I'm absolutely correct now and for all time and can never be wrong about anything again for the rest of my life. And I damn sure I'm not going to trust someone else's reasoning when they tell me they think God exists because they honked the horn in the car after they fell asleep at the wheel, or because nobody's ever produced a verse like one in the Quran. I don't even trust the reasoning of the greatest scientists to be right all the time, because they're just human like everybody else. You ever heard of Isaac Newton? Incredible scientist, also a Christian and an alchemist. That's why science is a collaborative process designed to try to minimize the inevitable errors arising from the imperfections in human reasoning. Science does not deny the existence of flawed reasoning. Science is rooted in the concept that reasoning is flawed. And again, I have to make it perfectly clear for you. This issue does not go away if you replace natural explanations with creationism. The flaws in human reasoning are exceedingly well demonstrated either way. So you, David Wood, have no more reason to trust your reasoning with extreme confidence than I or anyone else does. You're not special, Dave. Unfortunately for you, you're just as human as everyone else. So Dave, how much do you trust your reasoning now?
Not at all.
Oh, come on. You can trust it a little. Don't put yourself down. After all, it's been good enough to keep you alive this long. And honestly, I haven't seen more than a few clips of your videos, but from the ones I have seen, I get the impression that you're a reasonably smart guy. I honestly think that you can put together a logical argument that's not quite as easy to pick apart as this one is. But you should be careful about the distortion that'll occur in your reasoning when you start to consider things you have a strong emotional attachment to, like your religion. When you're considering that, you should be extra skeptical of every one of your own ideas and arguments because your brain is going to fight to make your reasoning work to protect that belief, even if you don't mean for it to. And of course, the more important the issue, the more careful you should be in your reasoning. Maybe ask someone else to try to poke holes in it so you can eliminate those weak spots. If you need a volunteer, I'm willing.
At best, we could have some confidence in our cognitive faculties when it comes to finding berries or using a spear against an enemy or doing something to attract a mate.
I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later, but for now I'll just point out that it's really odd that you think the ability to ponder the nature of reality has no survival benefit, and thus wouldn't be favored once it arose, considering that the human species completely dominates the entire planet now, pretty much only because we were able to do that. Well, that and the fact that we have curiosity and urge to find the truth. And even though we regularly fail to be skeptical enough to actually reach the truth, that inner drive, the feeling that we need to know, is part of what's kept us moving forward and what's led to the decent but far from complete understanding of how things work that we have so far. It's also why we have so many people so strongly committed to religion, because they feel that it gives them the truth, but that's another story. And also, what seems to you like the simple ability to pick berries and learn which ones are deadly and which ones aren't, means that humans are fully capable of determining a successful outcome from an unsuccessful one, which means we can tell when our reasoning works and when it doesn't, and so if we can critically examine the results of our logic and science, we're capable of identifying whether they worked or not, and so we're never totally in the dark about whether our reasoning is valid or not, as long as we're intellectually honest and we allow others to criticize and question our findings to make sure we didn't miss anything. We're not always going to be right, but in the long term, the results are going to speak for themselves.
Reason would have been selected because it helped perform these tasks, not because it produced true beliefs.
Right. Welcome to Earth, where the inmates are running the asylum. Human cognition works reasonably well to get us through our day-to-day lives. Not always, but usually. But it has all the flaws one would expect to find if it had evolved as a survival mechanism, and we're constantly having to be vigilant against our own biases and emotions and poor reasoning, and therefore your conclusion is, it's trustworthy, and so only God could have made it. Yeah, okay then. If anyone needed evidence that your reasoning is just as imperfect as anyone else's, there it is.
One obvious objection at this point is that reliable cognitive faculties do help organisms survive and reproduce. If you believe that jumping off this bridge will kill you, and I'm convinced that I'm a pigeon and can fly, I'm probably going to die and you're going to live and maybe have children, passing on those smart genes of yours to the next generation.
Right. To an extent, you have to be able to reason correctly to survive, even as a non-human animal. But of course, that's not universally true. One of the most common examples is the strong tendency of humans to see patterns, faces, and agency where they don't actually exist. As I said before, in the wild, you don't have the luxury of investigating carefully every time you see something that you think might be an enemy or a predator. You have a decision to make. Are you going to run, fight, or do nothing? And if you do nothing, you might die. And that's the foundation of an awful lot of human irrationality, such as when people start believing there's a poltergeist in the kitchen when something falls off the counter.
But there are two problems with this response. First, there's a massive difference between, on the one hand, beliefs that help us find food or a partner, and on the other hand, beliefs about ultimate reality or the origin of the universe or correct scientific methodology. The kinds of beliefs that help us survive and reproduce are usually grounded in basic observation and experience.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dave, which is why people have so much difficulty with those concepts, and why it took us such an enormous amount of time and effort to develop them. We evolved for a relatively small niche. We mainly have experience with things that are roughly a certain size, like as small as a sand grain and as big as however far we can see, and we mostly have experience with things that move at a certain speed, maybe as fast as a bird at most, except for much more rare events. And the totality of our experience doesn't last any longer than a human lifespan. Gravity works a certain way. There's a certain composition to the matter around us. Time seems to move relatively uniformly. When light bounces off a mirror, it seems like a pretty simple process of striking the surface and bouncing off like other bouncing objects we've seen. It seems totally obvious to us that objects exist and have the properties we perceive them to have. Our instincts, our lived experiences, and the anecdotes of our family and friends and our own perceptions and interpretations feel reliable, and yet, when you get into metaphysics, philosophy, logic, quantum electrodynamics, cosmology, or some other complex subject, those intuitive truths don't apply anymore, and it's a pretty rare person who can wrap their head around it easily. It takes a lot of education, usually with a lot of analogies to more relatable things they interact with day to day in the normal world, to give people some ability to visualize the concept, and even so, a lot of people just don't get it. So this is cool, man. You keep on making predictions about what should be observed if naturalism is true, and reality just keeps on matching them. But why are you helping to demonstrate naturalism? I thought this was supposed to be a video against naturalism.
My friend Thag died eating these berries, so I won't eat them!
Okay, you peppered your video with these cutesy little sketches with you dressed as a caveman to illustrate your points. And they're fun and everything, but most of them don't really tell me anything that you didn't already say, so I cut them out. But this one is interesting. So, this caveman can observe something that happens to another person and generalize it to himself because he realizes the similarities between himself and his friend. So he understands that if something can happen to his friend, that doesn't mean that it can only happen to his friend. It means it can happen to him too. Now, this kind of generalization can be really useful for survival. You've demonstrated that here, but when you do that in more complex cases, it can get you into trouble since you can wind up overgeneralizing. For example, if the one caveman was allergic to peanuts and the other one wasn't, and the only food around was peanuts and one of them died eating peanuts, the other one might think, oh my god, these peanuts killed my friend. These are deadly peanuts, I can't eat these. They'll kill me too. And then he dies unnecessarily of starvation. Or for another example, when people say, events I've seen within the universe were caused by something. Therefore, the universe requires a cause.
But even the lower mammals can do that. When a mouse sees his buddy stuck to a glue trap, he learns to avoid glue traps. Does this suggest in any way that rodents are capable of metaphysics or epistemology or ethics?
Of course not, but rodents aren't humans. Part of the reason for the extraordinary success of the human species is our ability to think symbolically. This is an incredibly useful adaptation that's led to the development of language, logic, mathematics, science, engineering, architecture, and pretty much everything else that's helped us excel. The survival advantage of this is obvious in the extreme, especially when you look at the city behind you and realize what that adaptation allows us to create. Rodents don't have this to the same extent as humans, but if they did, I don't see any reason why a mouse couldn't reason about metaphysics. If you're capable of learning to avoid glue traps when you see someone else stuck to one, then you're capable of understanding all the principles underlying reasoning about anything, including metaphysics. These principles aren't as complicated as you seem to think they are. You can understand the laws of logic. A glue trap is a glue trap is not a glue trap, and it's either a glue trap or it's not. You can also understand fundamental similarities between things. You see another mouse stuck to the trap and you understand that you're a similar creature that will react similarly to the glue trap, and so without ever experiencing that glue trap for yourself, you can learn to avoid it. So you can reason about how things are similar and how they're different. You can also understand cause and effect, which underpins science and the concept of therefore. A glue trap trapped that mouse, I am like that mouse, therefore the glue trap will trap me. And you're also capable of storing that information for later use. Now, of course, it probably doesn't understand that it's thinking these things or doing these things, but the fact remains that if it's learning to behave that way based on input, then at some level, its brain must be processing input, following those basic steps, and achieving those results, consciously or not. Otherwise, it wouldn't end up behaving that way. So all that's really missing here is the ability to think symbolically about those underlying principles of reasoning in order to express and formalize them. And if you can do that, you can apply them to anything you want, including metaphysics or epistemology or ethics. So the point is, by admitting that even a mouse can use the same fundamental reasoning skills as a human, you basically just killed your argument. By the way, the flaws in human reasoning about metaphysics are why we have people whose thought process goes something like, Thag makes spear. But who make Thag? Must be man, with power of many Thag. Just saying.
No! Even if you had a perfectly reliable belief-forming system in one area, say avoiding mousetraps, that wouldn't be any reason to trust the system in a far more sophisticated area, say avoiding logical fallacies.
You seem confused about how the brain works, man. It's not usually as specific as you seem to think it is. You do realize that the mouse's brain didn't evolve some mousetrap avoidance circuit, right? If it had, it wouldn't have had to learn to avoid the trap. It learned about mousetraps based on a more fundamental function of the brain. The mouse has some degree of reasoning ability, which it applies to learn to avoid the trap. I just explained before about how some general concepts can be applied to allow the mouse to avoid the trap. Some of those concepts might be built into the mouse as natural instinct, and others, like cause and effect, might be learned. But either way, they're natural, and they're useful for survival in a much more general sense than just avoiding mousetraps. This also applies to your earlier statement about humans finding berries, using spears, and attracting mates. All of that requires some basic level of reasoning ability, otherwise known as sanity, if we're going to have any hope of survival. We have to be able to make successful decisions with a good enough level of success for a decent number of us to survive. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be enough. We need to at least be capable of distinguishing berries from non-berries, poison berries from non-poison berries, successful picking from unsuccessful picking, and so on. As I say, it's not always perfect, and when it's not perfect, it'll be less likely to lead to success in those activities, but as long as it's good enough to let the species survive, it's good enough. So we already had the foundation of logic before we had modern symbolic thought, and since we already had that, there's no reason whatsoever to assume that this foundation crumbles as soon as we try to apply the same principles in a formal way using linguistic symbols. It's the very fact that these foundational principles are not specific to any one scenario like avoiding traps or picking berries that allows them to be combined with symbolic thought by humans and then used like Lego bricks to build up a vast array of concepts, including the definitions of logical fallacies. So you can say that we have no foundation for our reasoning if you really want to, but you've already admitted we do. And you yourself brought up logical fallacies. Well, that should tell you everything you need to know, shouldn't it? If we thought humans reasoned perfectly, it would never even occur to us to define logical fallacies because, well, humans would be incapable of fallacious reasoning, so the concept wouldn't even make any sense. The mere fact that we acknowledge and recognize logical fallacies includes an implicit assumption that human reasoning is not perfect.
My friend Thag died committing the fallacy of denying the antecedent, so I won't commit it!
You seem to be implying that you can't die by denying the antecedent. Well, here are some examples of how you can. These berries just kill Thag! So if I am Thag, berries can kill me. But I not Thag, so berries cannot kill me! Om nom 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 nom. There, that caveman denied the antecedent and now he's dead. Or if you want a more modern example, if the power is on in the house, then this cable is electrified. But the power isn't on in the house, so this cable isn't electrified. Bzzz. Or,
that mousetrap just killed that mouse. So if I am that mouse, the trap can kill me. But I'm not that mouse, so the mousetrap can't kill me. I'm coming to get you, cheese.
and by the way, that's the case with most logical fallacies. They're not hard to figure out because they have application to real situations. Although clearly they're not that easy to remember to apply consistently since humans and all other animals fail at it pretty regularly. The only real difference between humans and other animals is that we use symbols to formalize those fallacies and understand what we're actually doing when we use them, which is pretty useful for us. So yeah, you might want to rethink your example there a little bit. It's pretty easy to come up with ways that most logical fallacies can get you killed because fallacious reasoning reduces the accuracy with which you perceive your environment. So think carefully before you choose a different example, but ultimately it's not really the point whether any specific logical fallacy can get you killed or not, is it? Logical fallacies can also be learned from a deeper understanding of causation and logical absolutes that your examples show we're capable of understanding and turning into an understanding of fallacies regardless of whether the specific fallacies are instinctively understood or provide a survival benefit. And your point isn't about our ability to avoid using logical fallacies anyway, but more about our ability to formally define them. And so the real question here is whether our ability to structure our thinking in that way could help us survive. And the answer, again, is it let us take over the world. Well, that and opposable thumbs. So, no disrespect or anything, but I'm going to take reality's word over yours and suppose that it works well enough. Maybe not well enough to prevent us from nuking everyone to death 100 years from now, but everything has its limits.
Second, when it comes to survival and reproduction, false beliefs can often be just as effective as true beliefs. If you believe that jumping off this bridge will kill you, and I'm convinced that I'm a pigeon who can't fly because my wings have been cursed by the flying spaghetti monster, we both avoid the edge and we both survive.
Yes, and that's why a lot of ideas about the origin of religion consider it to have arisen out of usefulness. There's even some evidence that humans are partly hardwired to believe irrational things like religion and so on, probably as a result of the positive benefits, and regardless, religion does seem useful for social cohesion and helping to reduce the fear of death, unless you believe you're going to hell, I guess.
False beliefs can even be helpful in all kinds of situations. If you've got the hots for someone, but you're too shy to make a move, and the astrology hotline tells you that the position of the planet Venus is just right for love, your false belief in astrology might give you the confidence you need to meet that special someone.
Yes, indeed. Or if you believe that heaven is your reward, your false belief in God might give you the confidence to blow yourself up in an airport. Yeah, we're all aware that false beliefs can and do influence people. All of this is exactly what I would expect from a being evolved through a process of, if not everyone died, it's good enough. And it's exactly what I would not expect from a being created by a perfect deity. So yeah, God doesn't exist.
Here's the rub. When theists and naturalists argue about the world or morality or God, we enter the argument as if we're on some sort of intellectual neutral ground. Well, we all agree that our cognitive faculties are functioning properly, so let's take it from there and see what we can prove.
No, don't put words in my mouth. See, I don't know about theists, but a humble naturalist like me will agree that we're humans who are capable of making mistakes or of committing logical fallacies, maybe without even noticing it, or of being blinded by emotion or stubbornness, and generally of failing to be a totally objective robot with no irrational instincts at all. This applies to everyone, and that's why we need to constantly try to monitor ourselves for these flaws in our reasoning, and why we need to remain open to the criticisms of other people. We've done reasonably well over the past few millennia, I think. Look at what we've managed to do with our reasoning tools, both the built-in ones and the ones generated by a lot of careful thought and testing and calibration and reevaluation. But we could have done better, though. We can always do better. That's why I have conversations like this with people like you. That's why I'm always disappointed when people attempt to shut down the conversation by blocking people who they think are on the other side of some issue. You can listen to one person make a bunch of points and they can sound really convincing. Maybe for a few years you even believe them. I used to listen to the Young Turks and think Islam wasn't a problem. And look at me now. Because later on, maybe you hear someone talking from another perspective and you realize the original points you heard don't sound so solid after all. They contain very basic logical fallacies that you just didn't notice. Maybe your emotions took precedence over your sober use of your knowledge of logical fallacies. Maybe the fallacies were just really well concealed. Or maybe the points actually were solid, but the counterpoints you're hearing contain concealed logical fallacies that you aren't noticing now. This is why conversations are necessary, and this is why people change their minds over time. That's a good thing. When you recognize your own humanity, and thus your own flaws, and actively seek out different opinions and points in a genuine attempt to be as correct as possible, you're gonna be better off in the long run, even if the dogmatic thinkers around you try to use social pressure to keep your thoughts in line. The only way to reach the truth is to constantly work to find the flaws in every position. Every position. And most positions have at least some potential for refinement, while others are so mired in fallacious reasoning that they can be discarded altogether, even though a lot of them probably never will be. But hey, maybe I'm just being a stupid naturalist. Maybe, instead of recognizing my flaws and the flaws of every other human who's ever lived, I should just declare my reasoning perfect and infallible, and thus insist by fiat that everyone else is wrong, regardless of any faults those inferior idiots might point out in my reasoning. Even though other people being wrong kinda debunks my argument, cause it means human reasoning is unreliable.
But things aren't that simple. If naturalism is true, the causes of our reasoning ability are particles in motion, random mutation, and a selection process that favors passing on genetic information, not truth.
Which is exactly what happens. So, yet again, you've predicted what should happen under naturalism, and your prediction matches reality, so we have more evidence for naturalism. It's so bizarre for you to make a video arguing for naturalism.
The process that selected human reasoning ability is the exact same process that gave us the claws of a tiger and the colorful buttocks of a baboon.
Yes, it's a process heavily based around what helps a species survive. Claws help the tigers, colorful buttocks help the baboons, and symbolic thought helps the humans. And
we wouldn't rely on a big pigeon perch to get us from Manhattan to Brooklyn.
Back to this, huh? Well, I already talked about this. If precisely that same structure you're standing on was built as a pigeon perch, it'd still carry cars just fine, and we'd still rely on it, and it'd still work just as well. Similarly, if a log fell across a creek through nobody's intention at all, we could still use it as a bridge. This isn't rocket science, man. You know, rocket science, that thing that's hard because our reasoning's not perfect.
Why in the name of common sense would we rely on a mutant physical ability selected by a process that at least occasionally favors multicolored butt cheeks to get us to a correct view of ultimate reality?
So, you have a problem with using a tool for a purpose it doesn't do well at, but you're using common sense in a philosophical argument against naturalism? Common sense, the term that exists purely to describe things like remembering to unplug the kettle before you leave the house? Whatever, look, you just got done presenting an argument that the mind works based on naturalistic principles, and now you're whining that pure reason isn't good enough to get us to a correct view of ultimate reality? Well, obviously it isn't! If naturalism is true, why would it be? I agree with you that pure reason is not good enough to get to a correct view of ultimate reality. That's why even if I personally couldn't find any flaws in the reasoning of someone like Descartes in his reasoning that God exists, and I can find a hell of a lot, but let's pretend I can't, then I still wouldn't accept it. Because all the reasoning in the world, even if I'm personally not smart enough to find any flaws in it, can't take the place of an empirical demonstration of the existence of something precisely because reasoning is imperfect. Same with something like string theory. People say it sounds good on paper, but I want it to be experimentally demonstrated before I start to think it's true. That's why in theoretical physics, you have incredibly smart people generating incredibly smart theories that are ultimately proven wrong by experiment. Reason isn't good enough. All the philosophizing and wordplay in the world won't get us to the conclusion, therefore ultimate reality is X, or therefore God exists. And that's why I don't have any belief about the nature of ultimate reality, and why I don't believe in gods. I've heard literally hundreds of reason-based arguments for them, and that's fun and all, but none of them involve solid empirical evidence. And that's what I need, Dave. I got a fever, and the only prescription is more evidence. Reasoning alone just is not good enough. We can define words however we like, we can insert subtle fallacies and assumptions into it wherever we think it's necessary to reach our preferred conclusion, and we can sit around arguing about the meanings of all the words for the next several centuries, ultimately getting us nowhere. But when you employ the scientific method, you try to learn basic facts about reality by actually observing reality, free from interpretation, and then you try to come up with a theory to explain those facts, which makes as few assumptions as possible. And once you've got that, you can start to make further predictions based on that theory to verify aspects of it or disprove aspects of it, which then have to be improved or replaced. This is not pure rationalism. This is not the human mind trying to reason about the nature of reality from scratch. This is letting reality dictate the answers instead of letting human reason do all the work. This is how science is a tool to avoid the flaws in human reasoning. So I guess what I'm really trying to say, Dave, is you should become an atheist. You seem to understand all the basic problems with theism.
Why would we rely on reason to get us to true beliefs at all? It wasn't made for that, according to the naturalists.
Again, it doesn't matter what something was made for, or if it was made at all. What matters is what it's capable of. But I agree, we shouldn't rely on reason to get us to true beliefs. Not reason on its own, anyway. We rely on empirical evidence to get us to tentative conclusions that are subject to revision when we find more evidence. It's the best we got. Take it or leave it.
Naturalism, then, doesn't just rule out knowledge of God, it rules out knowledge of pretty much anything.
That depends on what exactly you mean by knowledge. If you're using some definition based on absolute certainty, then yeah, it does. Because it doesn't allow for the arrogance of the religious who tell us that their reasoning about their God is perfect, and they know that they know that they know everything they believe with absolute certainty, and therefore any evidence that contradicts any of it has to be wrong. But if you just mean believing something to a high degree of certainty based on the weight of the evidence, allowing for the chance that your knowledge could be incorrect, which is the way I'd use the word because I'm humble enough to accept my own limitations, then it allows knowledge just fine.
It's not only a threat to belief in spirits, it's also a threat to belief in science.
You spent all this time explaining why pure reason is not a reliable means to obtain true information, and now you're saying that that's a threat to science? No, pure reason is not science. How many times do I have to say this? In fact, the entire point of science is the rejection of the idea that pure reason can be reliably used like that. The obvious flaws in human reasoning are exactly why infallibility and the divine perfection of human cognition are not assumed as part of the scientific method. It's why the main point of the scientific method is to track down flaws, not to declare absolute truth. If you assume you're absolutely right all the time, then you're vastly more likely to be wrong in the future because your ideas are inflexible, and you'll need to ignore future evidence rather than changing to a accommodate it. But if you want to go deeper than that into the philosophy of science, then you could say that the empiricism behind science required reason alone to build it up as a concept, yes. And I would agree, which is why science, like all concepts, has to remain open to criticism, revision, and even potentially replacement. Of course, since science has been so incredibly productive as a process, I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon. The proof is in the pudding, as they say, but it's possible. Of course, this threat to science, if you really want to call it that, because honestly I'd consider it much more of a threat to religion that's never produced anything practical rather than science that constantly produces practical things, this threat is not naturalism. Naturalism has nothing to do with it. The actual threat you're talking about is skepticism. Skepticism is, in a sense, a threat to every belief there is, because true skepticism involves doubting and questioning every single belief and every single pattern of reasoning there is. Personally, I like that. I want everything anyone thinks to be subject to constant scrutiny, including everything I think. I want to wake up in the morning and immediately start interrogating my deepest principles and beliefs for any inconsistencies or insufficiencies I can find. And I do that because I believe the words of Epictetus: it is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows.
And I have to ask, since you naturalists tell me there's no afterlife, what happens when you commit intellectual suicide?
No, Dave. Intellectual suicide is not admitting you can be wrong. Intellectual suicide is assuming you're right and then refusing to ever correct yourself again as a result, thereby willfully making yourself far more likely to be wrong. When you do this, your intellect doesn't even enter into the picture. Your position isn't based on intellect, much less intellectual honesty. Your position is only based in that extreme kind of arrogance rarely seen in anyone except the religious. Okay, so you basically repeat yourself for the next couple minutes, so I'll skip that bit and get to the point.
This sort of blind faith in naturalism completely undermines any confidence in our human reasoning ability, and therefore undermines any confidence in what reason produces, namely our beliefs, including our belief in naturalism.
Again, naturalism has nothing to do with that. You seem to have trouble distinguishing between distinct concepts. That's a pet peeve of mine. No, what undermines our confidence in our reasoning is the fact that our reasoning has been constantly demonstrated to be imperfect. Just the mere fact that people reach different conclusions based on the same information should be enough to demonstrate that, but it of course goes much further than that. Naturalism or no naturalism, our reasoning cannot be absolutely trusted. Not yours, not mine, not anyone's. And therefore, yes, we should avoid having total confidence in our beliefs because we can be wrong. You could be wrong about God, Dave. I know you don't want to believe it, but you can. Committed naturalists could be wrong about naturalism. So we need to start from the evidence and go from there. It's all we can do. And the evidence so far is this: nature seems to exist. Full stop. When it comes to ultimate reality, that's really the best we got right now. And so if we want to explain ultimate reality, we're going to have to start there. There's no God there. Nor is there an assertion that no God can be there. There's no assertion that the answer has to be naturalistic and there can be no supernatural explanation. Nobody's saying that. But we don't assume supernatural causation when all that's been demonstrated so far is natural causation. I don't understand why this has to be explained so often because it's really not that complicated. The idea of using the fewest assumptions possible to explain the evidence is important because that's how you make sure your theory fits to reality as tightly as possible. If you walk into a room and you find a guy lying in a puddle of blood with a bullet hole in his head and no gun around, you have every right to assume that aliens created a fake body using alien magic and planted it in the room so they could observe the reactions of the humans. It's a possibility, but I would propose you might be better off cutting out that unnecessary assumption and starting off by supposing, based on your current knowledge of how past shootings have occurred and your lack of evidence for highly unusual circumstances, that a human shot him. Sure, it could be aliens, yes. The possibility can remain open, but why start with that assumption? So when we're presented with something new to explain, we start investigating it based on what we have evidence for right now and experience with right now, instead of trying to reason our way to belief in something we haven't even demonstrated yet. Like God. You know, man, if you tighten it up a little bit, you could use this video as an advertisement for skepticism. Oddly though, even though you're arguing in skepticism's favor, you seem a little bit down on it. I wonder why that is.
So, if we take naturalism seriously, we can't take naturalism seriously.
I don't know why you think that if you're humble enough to not be absolutely certain of your positions, then you can't even take those positions seriously. You realize you can take an idea seriously without even believing it at all, right? Let alone being absolutely certain of it.
Behold the incredible self-destructing worldview.
Yeah, says the Christian whose video against naturalism convincingly argues for naturalism and the skepticism of religious claims.
There is an alternative, however. Christians believe we're created in the image of God with the ability to learn about everything up to and including our Creator. Does this give us a basis for trusting our reasoning ability? Absolutely.
No, it doesn't give you any more basis for trusting your reasoning than any other flawed human has. It just makes you think it does. It turns you into an arrogant fool who thinks he's definitely right and there's no chance he can be wrong. God exists because I reason he exists, and that reason's definitely correct because God exists. Yeah, you believe you're correct because you believe you're correct, I get it. So if you disagree with me and don't believe what I believe, obviously you're wrong, even if you use the logic and science humans have developed from the ground up based on observation of how reality works and tested over generations. Those just don't compare to my God. It doesn't matter if mere humans say my reasoning contains logical fallacies. God says my reasoning is correct, and therefore it is. Dave, your reasoning's totally circular. It tells you absolutely nothing about whether you're right. This bridge will hold a car because I think it will hold a car, and I'm definitely right because the bridge will hold a car. Yeah, good luck with that, man. I'll enjoy seeing your collapsing bridge on the news. Look, I thought your religion was supposed to be all about humility. So why have you allowed yourself to become so arrogant based on so little? But then again, Christianity also denigrates doubt. Refusing to doubt your own beliefs isn't very humble at all. There's yet another contradiction in Christianity that I don't hear talked about very often. Or maybe it's not arrogance that's driving you. Maybe you just lack the confidence in your own intelligence to admit that you might not be the perfect thinker. Now, me, I don't require that assumption because I'm perfectly content to have only my good ideas hold up under scrutiny and drop my bad ones like the garbage they are and get better ones. I've done it tons of times because I'm much humbler than you are.
Think you're really righteous? Think you're pure in heart? Well, I know I'm a million times as humble as thou art.
You know, I gotta say, this entire video sounds like an expression of the typical religious fear of doubt. The abject terror in the face of uncertainty. Dave, if you ever escape the religious mentality, you'll find that it's really not that bad to not be a cocky religious dude bragging about his superpower of being totally reasonable, even while simultaneously not giving a flying fuck about logical fallacies or even about holding internally consistent positions. Ignorance of your own ignorance might seem like bliss right now, but there really are better ways to live. The weirdest thing about all of this, though, is I didn't think Christians believed that humans are perfect beings at all. As a matter of fact, I thought it was decidedly the opposite. We're fallen beings in need of redemption and our reasoning is flawed and pitiful compared to God's. But what, we're still perfect thinkers? You adhere to a very unusual kind of Christianity, it seems to me.
Our cognitive faculties aren't simply the product of natural selection acting on random mutation, and they serve a greater purpose than finding food. In other words, our ability to reason about ourselves and the world and God makes perfect sense on my worldview, but it makes no sense on naturalism.
Therefore God exists. No, Dave, it makes no sense at all on your worldview. Try harder. And don't come back at me with this shit about, but you're a naturalist, how can you reason that I'm wrong? Just in case you or one of your fans comes back with that. You haven't said naturalists are less capable of reasoning. You've said human reasoning is trustworthy, and therefore God exists. So according to that, naturalists' reasoning is trustworthy as well. So fine, if my reasoning is trustworthy, then you'd better trust this reasoning unless you want to destroy your own premise. Your worldview is based on circular reasoning, and it's riddled with logical fallacies and contradictions both with itself and with reality, so nothing makes sense based on it, and the only thing it's good for is to give people like me something to kill time laughing at.
We can continue arguing about the existence of God all day long then, but a little reflection shows that in arguing about anything, we've already come down on the side of theism.
Dave, if we have to argue about anything, then we two humans have reasoned about the same thing in two different and contradictory ways and reached different conclusions, and thus human reasoning is not trustworthy. You claim trustworthy human reasoning is to be expected under theism, and since the fact that we're arguing demonstrates that human reasoning is not trustworthy, then theism is disproven by your own criteria. Your argument killed itself. Well done.
Of course, you naturalists are free to suppress the truth. You can continue pretending that your worldview allows things like logical laws or objective moral values or...
Objective moral values? That doesn't even make sense as a sequence of words. It's an oxymoron. Values are subjective by definition. That's the whole point of the word. They're preferences. Some people want to live in a society where people don't kill each other rather than a crime-ridden hellhole. Other people just want total chaos where everyone battles each other for survival. Yeah, both values objectively exist as part of a brain's configuration, but that's not what you're trying to say. And neither one of those values is objectively correct because correct and incorrect don't apply to taste. Taste just is. People might feel very strongly that their values are superior because the effect they believe those values will have if they're implemented will be better for human beings, or the society, or their gods, than all other values. And the order in which they prioritize those is also a subjective value. But that doesn't change the definition of the word values and make these values correct or incorrect in and of themselves. If one of your values is that all humans should be destroyed, other people will disapprove and they'll deem your values harmful or inferior based on their own values, which are not objectively correct or incorrect, not because the universe gives a shit, but because they give a shit. But their condemnation doesn't make you factually wrong. The closest you can get is to determine whether someone's values are compatible with someone else's values, and whether that someone else is a human or a god is totally irrelevant. Your values don't become objectively correct just because they match the subjective preferences of another human being or a god, because that would require a change to the definition of the word values. And if you do that, you're not talking about values anymore, you're talking about something else. However, you can objectively test if actions and policies will help society to align with the subjective values of an individual. So for example, some of my values are people should not kill each other, and people should be free to do as they wish. But there's some degree of conflict between those values, so what we're going to have to do is try to reason our way to a balance point between them, and then actually test it to see how well it works. And once we've seen some results, we'll have to adjust and refine as necessary, or start again from scratch. And that's why the laws of different countries are constantly changing and evolving. People have different ideas about what will help to achieve the society that they want. And generally, you can tell if what you've implemented has actually helped to achieve the kind of society that you wanted. I mean, if you try to implement policies for the good of the people and you end up with Stalinist Russia, I mean, the results are pretty clear, objectively. So, if you and I can agree that we both subjectively value a society in which people don't kill each other, in your case, because you think God wants that, and in my case, because I would rather live in a peaceful country rather than, say, 2016 Syria, then we can work together to figure out how we can set things up to objectively decrease the murder rate. Or to make a long story short, values equals subjective, how well results align with those values equals objective. You understand what equals means, right? It's based on a logical law we were able to intuit because we have to understand the concept of similarity to survive. By the way, slight tangent, I'm not sure if I've ever addressed this before since I normally only address topics that come up in the videos I respond to, but I'd like to speak to it briefly because I think it's important and also it could be brought up as an objection to what I've just said. So there's this common objection from the religious that if you weren't created by God, then sure, okay, maybe it makes sense that you care about making a better world right now since you have to live in it, but why would you care about also maintaining the world for the future after you're dead? And the answer is very simple. Humans are tribal. The reason we care about our descendants is blindingly obvious. That's the whole point of reproducing. So already we have an incentive right there. But that tribal thinking can easily extend to future people who aren't our descendants as well. The world's not like it used to be. It's much easier now to have a global perspective, to think of humanity as one unified group. The way I think about it, usually, and not always, I have different scopes that I think about humanity within and different segments of humanity, but usually, it's our species against the universe. So let's help our group excel. But obviously not everyone thinks like that. Not everyone does care about future people, and so they're willing to take actions now that could destroy the environment over time. To some extent, most of us care a little bit less about future people, and so we don't really think about the passive elements of our lifestyle that could be harmful in the future. That's natural too. The more distant the people are, generally the less you care about them. Which is also why a lot of people don't really care about people in other countries. Or they don't care about people outside their city. Or they only care about their family and everyone else can go fuck themselves. But all of this comes from the very natural tribalism that's been both such a useful tool and such a danger. Okay, moving on.
Reliable cognitive faculties. You can keep borrowing beliefs and concepts from my worldview that your own worldview just can't support.
I don't have much else to say, man. You just argued for naturalism, argued for the skepticism of everything, including religion, and killed theism, all in one video. You made a more compelling case than I ever could have for why atheism is a good choice, and even for why it's not a good idea to believe in the supernatural, regardless of whether you would assert that the natural is all there is or not. You've demonstrated your profound arrogance and your inability to detect even the most basic problems with your own thought process, and you've shown that this is because you're blinded by your circular reasoning and you're feeling that you must be right and everyone else must be wrong. Even though, based on your own argument, nobody should be wrong. I don't think I've ever seen anyone argue against their own worldview as convincingly as you did here. I'm glad to have an ally in you, Dave. We atheists thank you for your service.
You can even go on using your mutant berry finding ability to convince yourselves that the natural world is all that exists.
Will do, until you can demonstrate that I can also find supernatural berries.
But if you really buy that, I've got a lovely bridge I'd like to sell you.
No thanks, I only buy supernatural bridges. Let me know when you reason one of those into existence and I'll buy that. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment, tell me what you thought. If you liked this video, be sure to thumb it up and subscribe and share it. And if you really like my channel, you can support me on Patreon. And you see here the people who support me at $10 or more, and here are the people who support me at $5 or more but less than 10. Every single person who's contributing on Patreon is very much appreciated, as are the people who are contributing on PayPal, which you can also do if you want to do a one-off donation. And if you want to get updates or just talk to me, Twitter's the best way, and I also use Facebook sometimes, so follow me in both those places or whichever one you prefer, and I'll see you soon.
If you are not a subscriber of Logicked, check out that channel and let's see if we can bump up that sub count a little bit because he deserves it. It's a terrific channel.